The stagecoach groaned, its leather straps sighing like a tired old man settling into his bones. It listed to one side as it rolled to a halt, the horses stamping and blowing clouds of dust that mingled with the fine, gritty powder already hanging in the afternoon air. For a moment, the world was nothing but a haze of reddish-brown, a curtain drawn between the known and the unknown. Then, the dust began to settle, revealing Hollow Ridge. It wasn't much of a town, more a collection of ideas that had run out of steam halfway to becoming something real, a single, wide street, flanked by weathered buildings with false fronts that aimed for grandeur and achieved only a weary dignity. The scent of pine from the low, rolling hills to the east fought a losing battle against the smells of dust, horse, and the sharp tang of the blacksmith's forge. From within the coach, a figure moved, not with the hurried relief of a long-journeyed passenger, but with a deliberate, measured grace. Clara Estelle Ward stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her worn leather boots making a soft thud. She did not wait for the driver's offered hand. She never did. In her arms, she clutched a heavy wooden chest, its corners bound in tarnished brass. It held everything she owned that mattered: bolts of muslin and calico, spools of thread in a dozen sober colors, and, tucked beneath it all, a roll of paper patterns, the language in which she was most fluent. She was 28, an age when many women of her time were already mothers to a handful of children, their lives woven into the fabric of a husband's name. Clara's life was a bolt of uncut cloth. She stood a little taller than most women, a fact that had been pointed out to her since she was a girl, never as a compliment. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a severe knot at the nape of her neck, a practical measure against the wind that was already tugging at loose strands, whipping them across a face that was handsome but rarely soft. Her eyes, a clear, steady gray, took in the town without judgment and without fear. They simply observed. Men leaning against the posts of the general store stopped their whittling to watch her. Women peered from behind twitching lace curtains in the few proper houses that lined the street. A lone woman, unescorted, carrying her own baggage. Standing as if she owned the ground beneath her feet, it was a sight that demanded notice in a place like Hollow Ridge. She felt their eyes on her, a familiar pressure, like a too-tight corset. For a fleeting second, the old voices swirled in her head, carried on the wind with the dust. They were the ghosts she had traveled 1,500 miles to outrun, not the ghosts of the dead, but of the living, the voice of her father, Colonel Ward, a man who measured the world in straight lines and sharp commands. A daughter's constitution should be gentle. Clara, yours is resolute. He'd said it as if diagnosing an ailment. Stubbornness is a flaw in a woman. It suggests a lack of agreeable spirit. He had wanted her to be a polished adornment to his military legacy, a woman who would marry another officer and manage a household with quiet, efficient grace. He had not known what to do with a daughter who preferred the logic of a sewing pattern to the politics of a social call, whose hands were more comfortable with a needle and thimble than a teacup. Then there were the other voices, the softer, more insidious whispers of the women in his circle, the aunts and the wives of his fellow officers. Such a shame she's so tall. It's imposing. She has opinions. You see, men don't care for opinions. And the final, damning verdict, delivered by a would-be suitor to her father, a conversation she was not meant to overhear but had. Through a half-closed study door. She is an admirable woman, Colonel, but not pliable. She is not a woman a man can shape. Unfit, I fear, for the comforts of marriage. Asterisk, unfit. Asterisk. The word had not been a shout, but a brand, pressed quietly against her soul. It hadn't been a single moment of rejection, but a lifetime of small cuts. The slow, steady erosion of being told that her very nature was a mistake. They wanted her to bend, to soften, to shrink, and she had tried. For years, she had tried to fold herself into a smaller shape, to quiet the voice in her head that asked, why? To lower her eyes and curb her stride. But it was like trying to force a pine tree to grow like a weeping willow. It was a violation of its core. The chest in her arms grew heavier. It was not the weight of the fabric, but the weight of that final conversation with her father. He had stood before the fireplace, ramrod straight, his disappointment a cold, palpable thing in the room. There is no place for you here. Clara, if you will not abide by the simple expectations of your station, I have secured you a small inheritance from your mother's side. What you do with it is your own concern, but you cannot stay here and continue this defiance. She had not been defying him. She had simply been trying to be herself. And so, she was not running away from anyone. She was running toward herself, toward a life where the height of her stature and the strength of her will were not seen as flaws to be corrected. She was running toward a place where she could build something with her own two hands, a life that did not require the approval of a husband or the sanction of society, a life where she did not have to apologize for the space she occupied in the world. Hollow Ridge had been a name on a map, a place far enough away that the echoes of those voices would, she prayed, finally fade. It was a place on the edge of things, a town where people came to start over, or so the land agent had told her, a place for misfits. Perhaps, she thought, she would finally fit in among them. A gust of wind, stronger this time, threw a sheet of sand against her face. It stung her cheeks, but she didn't flinch or turn away. She tasted the grit on her lips and set her jaw. Two men, their faces unshaven and their hats pulled low, swaggered out of the saloon. Their eyes caught her, and a slow, mocking grin spread across one man's face. "Well now, look what the wind blew in," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. "Looks like we got ourselves a giantess. Jed." His companion chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "She's a tall drink of water. All right, maybe she's looking for a man tall enough to dance with." Clara's hands tightened on the handle of her chest. The knuckles showed white. A hot flush of shame and anger rose in her throat. The familiar burn of being singled out, of being made a spectacle. The old impulse was there: lower your head. Hurry past. Pretend you didn't hear. Let them have their moment of cruel sport and be on your way. It was the path of least resistance, the one she had been taught to take her entire life. But something in the raw, unforgiving air of this place held her fast. The dust, the wind, the hard, unyielding earth beneath her feet, they were not gentle. They did not apologize for their nature. And in that moment, Clara Estelle Ward made a choice. She did not lower her eyes. She did not hurry her step. She turned her head slowly and looked directly at the two men. She said nothing. Her gaze was not angry, not fearful, not challenging. It was simply level. A calm, gray assessment that took them in and found them wanting. She held their eyes for a long, silent beat, a stillness in the heart of the swirling wind. The men's smirks faltered. They shifted on their feet, their bluster suddenly seeming hollow and childish in the face of her profound, quiet dignity. Then she turned away, not in retreat, but because they were no longer worth her attention. She adjusted her grip on the chest, feeling the solid reality of the wood beneath her fingers. She had a destination, a small, abandoned fabric depot at the far end of the street, which she had rented by mail. It was to be her shop, her home, her world. With her back straight, her head held high, and her gaze fixed on the dusty path ahead, Clara began to walk. The wind whipped at her skirts, and the dust tried to blur her way. But she moved with the unwavering certainty of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of being told which way to go, chosen her own direction. She was walking toward a life she had never been allowed, and she would not be turned aside, not by the ghosts of the past, and not by the taunts of the present, not anymore. The walk to the far end of Hollow Ridge's main street was longer than it looked on the land agent's crude map. Each step was a small victory, a claim staked in the dusty earth. The boardwalks underfoot were uneven, some planks warped by the sun, others missing entirely. And Clara had to mind her footing while balancing the considerable weight of her wooden chest. The initial confrontation with the men from the saloon had left a bitter taste in her mouth, a familiar acid of humiliation and anger. Yet, her quiet defiance had also kindled something new within her, a small, steady flame of resolve in a place that had long been cold and dark. She would not be cowed. This was the first rule of her new life. The depot was just coming into view, a forlorn-looking structure set back a little from the main thoroughfare, when she heard the scuff of boots behind her. It wasn't one set, but several, hurried and deliberately loud. Her shoulders tensed. She did not need to look back to know who it was. They had stewed in her silence, and their bruised pride had followed her. "Hold up there, ma'am," the same slurring voice from before called out. Clara kept walking. To stop would be to cede control. A figure moved a step in front of her, blocking her path. It was Jed, the one with the mocking grin. He was joined by his companion and a third man, another drifter with restless eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. They formed a loose semicircle, effectively penning her in against the blank wall of the feed store. "Didn't you hear me? I said hold up," Jed insisted, planting his feet wide. He made a show of looking at her chest. "That looks mighty heavy for a lady to be carrying all on her lonesome. Ain't you got a man to do that for you?" "Maybe she ain't got a man." The second one, Silas, snickered. "Maybe she's looking for one. A woman travels this far alone. She's either running from the law or looking for a husband." "Which is it, miss?" the third man asked, stepping closer. The air grew thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. "You got a name, or should we just call you Too Tall?" Clara set the chest down on the ground. The thud was solid, final. She placed her hands on her hips, a gesture her father had always despised, calling it unladylike and combative. Right now, it felt like armor. She straightened to her full height, which put her eye level with the shortest of them, and looking down just slightly on Jed. She met his gaze and held it, her gray eyes as flat and unyielding as a winter sky. The silence stretched. It was her only weapon, and she wielded it with a precision that began to unnerve them. They were accustomed to hysterics or submission, to fear or flirtation. This cold, silent appraisal was something else entirely. "Cat got your tongue." Jed's grin was strained now. He took a half-step forward, reaching a hand out as if to touch her arm. "We're just trying to be neighborly." It was the hand, the casual assumption of his right to touch her, that made the small flame inside her flare into a hot, cleansing fire. But before she could speak, before she could utter the scalding words coiled in her throat, a shadow fell over them. It was a long shadow, cast by a figure who had approached with the quiet tread of a hunter. The men felt the change in the air before they saw him. Their bravado, already faltering, evaporated completely. They turned, and Clara's eyes followed theirs. He stood just behind them, a backdrop of dusty denim and worn leather against the harsh afternoon sun. The outline of him was sharp, unadorned. He was tall, taller even than she was by half a head, with the lean, hard-muscled build of a man who spent his life in the saddle. A low-brimmed hat, stained by sweat and trail dust, shadowed most of his face, but it couldn't hide the firm line of his jaw or the fact that his attention was fixed, unwavering, on Clara. He hadn't said a word, hadn't made a move, yet his very presence had sucked all the swagger out of the air. Jed and his companions shuffled their feet. They glanced at the silent man, then back at Clara, their pack courage dissolving into individual cowardice. "We was just offering the lady some help," Jed mumbled, the lie thin and obvious. The tall man's gaze didn't waver from Clara. It was as if the other men had ceased to exist. After a long moment, he shifted his weight, and the sunlight caught his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were blue, not the warm, friendly blue of a summer sky, but the pale, piercing blue of distant mountains on a cold day. They were eyes that looked at the world and missed nothing. He spoke, his voice low and even, with a rough-hewn quality like weathered timber. He wasn't addressing the men who were now backing away, trying to appear casual in their retreat. He was speaking only to her. Need the way cleared. The question hung in the air. It was a simple offer, devoid of flourish or condescension. It wasn't the gallant pronouncement of a knight coming to a maiden's rescue. It was a practical inquiry from one stranger to another. He wasn't assuming she was helpless. He was acknowledging she was obstructed. The distinction was one she had waited her entire life for someone to make. He was giving her the choice, the power. The men, Jed, Silas, and the other, had already cleared the way, melting back toward the saloon without another word. Their retreat more eloquent than any apology. The street was empty again, save for the two of them. Clara looked from the retreating backs of her tormentors to the still figure before her. She saw the weathered lines around his eyes, the set of a mouth that didn't look like it smiled often. He was waiting for her answer, the expected response, the polite and proper thing to say, would be, "Thank you." But the words felt inadequate, and somehow untrue. He hadn't saved her. He had simply stood witness to her saving herself. His presence had been the tipping point, but the foundation of her defense had been her own. She bent down, her movements fluid and unhurried, and gripped the handle of her chest. With a clean lift, she brought it back to rest against her hip. She looked him square in the eye, that startling, winter blue gaze. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But if you care to walk along." The invitation was an impulse, one she didn't fully understand herself. It was a dismissal and an acceptance all in one. Asterisk, I do not require a protector, but I will not refuse a companion. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or respect passed through his cool eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't speak. He simply turned and began to walk, falling into step not beside her, but a half-pace behind and to her right. A silent, unassuming escort. They walked the final 50 yards to the depot in a silence that was vastly different from the one she had used as a weapon moments before. This was a comfortable quiet, a space that didn't need to be filled with idle chatter. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the sighing of the wind through the eaves of the buildings. Clara found herself acutely aware of his presence. It was not imposing or threatening. It was simply there, a solid, steady anchor in the turbulent waters of this new place. She didn't look at him, but she could feel the quiet way he moved, a man entirely at ease in his own skin, in his own silence. They arrived at the old depot. It was worse than she had imagined. The sign, which once might have read, "Hollow Ridge Textiles," was faded to illegibility, hanging from a single rusty hinge. A window was boarded up, and the paint on the siding was peeling away in long, curling strips, revealing the gray, sun-bleached wood beneath. It looked abandoned, forgotten. A wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over her. What had she done, traveled all this way for a ruin? The man, Luke Calhoun, though she did not know his name, then stopped at the edge of the dilapidated porch. He watched her as she took in the sight, his expression unreadable beneath his hat. He saw the slight sag in her shoulders, the momentary faltering of her resolve. But then he saw her chin lift. He saw her eyes scan the building not with despair, but with a new, calculating light. She was seeing not what it was, but what it could be. She was measuring it for new curtains, a new sign, a new life. Clara stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning in protest. She set her chest down by the door. The sound was definitive. She was here. This was hers. She turned to thank the stranger, to dismiss him formally, but he was already turning to leave. He had seen her to her destination. and his purpose was fulfilled. He paused and tipped the brim of his hat in a gesture so slight it was barely a movement at all. "Ma'am," he said. The single word, a complete statement. And then he was gone, walking back the way they came, his long strides eating up the ground with an easy, unhurried rhythm. Clara watched him go, a tall, solitary figure receding into the dusty glare of the late afternoon. She didn't know his name, or why he had stopped for her. All she knew was that in a town that had so far offered her only suspicion and scorn, one person had looked at her and seen not a problem to be solved or a creature to be mocked, but a woman walking her own path. And, for a little while, he had simply walked it with her. The key to the depot was a piece of rusted iron that felt cold and final in Clara's hand. It turned in the lock with a reluctant screech, a sound of protest from a place long left to itself. The door swung inward on groaning hinges, opening not into a room, but into a tomb of stale air and forgotten things. A thick blanket of dust covered everything, softening the hard edges of broken crates and a derelict counter. Sunlight struggled through a grimy window pane, illuminating a galaxy of dancing dust motes. The air was heavy with the scent of decay of mice and mildew and the slow, patient rot of abandoned wood. For a disoriented moment, standing on the threshold between the harsh, windy reality of Hollow Ridge and this suffocating stillness, Clara felt a crippling wave of despair. The voices of her past whispered that this was it. This was her place, a forgotten, useless shell. But then, the seamstress in her took over. The part of her that saw not a ruined garment, but the potential of the fabric. The part that knew any tear could be mended with a steady hand and enough time. Her shoulders, which had slumped, straightened. Her eyes, which had seen only ruin, began to see work. She propped the door open, letting the wind and the light sweep through. A much-needed exorcism. She had purchased a few bare necessities at the general store before coming here: a stiff-bristled broom, a bucket, a block of harsh lye soap. They were her first tools of reclamation. She took off her traveling jacket, rolled up the sleeves of her sensible cotton blouse, and tied a spare kerchief over her hair. Then she began. The work was hard, physical, and deeply satisfying. Sweeping was an act of archaeology, uncovering the depot's history in layers of dust, dirt, and debris. She found old shipping labels, a child's lost wooden soldier, and a single, elegant lady's glove, its fine kid leather stiff with age. Each sweep of the broom was a clearing of the past, both the room's and her own. When she scrubbed the floors, the lye soap bit into the grime and stung her hands. The sharp, clean smell chasing away the mustiness. The pain was real, a welcome contrast to the formless ache she had carried in her chest for so long. This was a pain she could understand. This was the cost of making something new. For 3 days, she toiled. She pried the warped boards from the broken window and, after a careful negotiation with the blacksmith, had him fashion new hinges so it could be propped open for air. She scrubbed the walls until the wood grain reappeared, pale and weary, like an old woman's skin. She repaired the counter, hammering the loose planks back into place, her blows ringing out with a satisfying finality in the empty room. During that time, the people of Hollow Ridge watched her. Women on their way to the Mercers would slow their pace, their curiosity warring with their propriety. Men would pause, seeing her lift a heavy board or swing a hammer, and would exchange glances, some amused, some disdainful. No one offered to help. Clara did not expect them to. This was her battle, her penance, her creation. She was building not just a shop, but a fortress, and its walls were made of her own sweat and determination. On the 4th day, the room was transformed. It was still sparse, still scarred with the marks of its former life, but it was clean. It was hers. She finally allowed herself to open the heavy wooden chest, her personal treasure. She lifted out the bolts of fabric, her hands caressing the smooth percale, the sturdy denim, the soft, comforting flannel. She stacked them on the shelves she had built behind the counter, their colors a quiet rebellion against the drabness of the town. She arranged her spools of thread by shade, a neat, disciplined rainbow. Lastly, she unrolled her paper patterns on the newly scrubbed counter, their familiar shapes a comfort, a language she understood perfectly. She was mending, with every nail she drove, every inch of floor she scrubbed, every bolt of cloth she placed. She was stitching the frayed edges of her own spirit back together. The room was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, and in its quiet, sunlit space, she began to feel the first fragile stirrings of peace. She had been there for a week when he appeared. The shop door was open, and a fragile rectangle of late morning sun lay across the floorboards. Clara was at her work table, a small, sturdy piece she had salvaged and repaired, her head bent over a torn seam in her own apron. She was so absorbed in the tiny, even stitches that she didn't hear him approach. She felt him first, a sudden blockage of the light, a change in the quality of the air. She looked up. Luke Calhoun stood in the doorway. He was just as she remembered, tall enough that he had to stoop slightly to clear the frame, his presence filling the space without a sound. His hat was in his hands, held loosely at his side, revealing a head of thick, dark hair cut short, and a face that was all angles and planes, tanned by the sun to the color of worn saddle leather. His blue eyes, those startlingly cold, clear eyes, took in the room. They scanned the clean floors, the neat shelves of fabric, her small workspace. It wasn't a judgmental look, but an observant one. He was simply recording the facts of the place. Then his eyes settled on her. Clara's needle paused in midair. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She had not seen him since that first day, though she had been unconsciously looking for him in the sparse crowds on the street. He stepped inside, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the clean wood. He carried a bundle of dark, heavy material in the crook of his arm. Without a word, he walked to the counter and laid it down. It was a leather jacket, thick and clearly well worn, its surface showing the creases and scuffs of a hard life. A long, clean tear ran from the top of the shoulder down the back, a significant wound that would have rendered the garment useless to most. He had not said a word of greeting. He simply placed the jacket on the counter, his movements economical and precise. Then, from the pocket of his denim trousers, he produced a coin. It was a silver dollar, gleaming under the morning light. He set it down next to the jacket. The metallic clink was the first sound to break the silence between them. The coin and the jacket sat on the counter. A clear, unspoken business proposition. Asterisk. Here is the work. Here is the payment. Clara rose and walked to the counter, her own movements slow and deliberate. She ran her fingers along the tear in the leather. It was thick, tough hide. Mending it would require a heavy needle, an awl perhaps, and strong, waxed thread. It would be difficult work. She looked from the jacket to the silver dollar. It was far too much money. It was payment not just for the work, but for the silence, a way of keeping the transaction impersonal, of preventing any debt, emotional or otherwise. She looked up at him. He was watching her, his face a mask of neutrality, but his eyes, she saw, were not neutral. They were wary. He was braced for something, a refusal, a comment on the damage, a question he did not want to answer. "You don't need to pay," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. It was an offer, an attempt to brush aside the cold formality of the coin and acknowledge the unspoken thing that had passed between them in the street that first day. His expression hardened instantly. The wariness in his eyes sharpened into a defensive pride. Cold and sharp as chipped flint, he had misunderstood. He had heard her kindness and mistaken it for charity. "Don't need pity," he replied, his voice a low growl. It was a rejection, a wall of thorns thrown up around him. The words were a clear message, asterisk. I am not a charity case. I am not weak. Clara felt the sting of his response, the unfairness of it. The old Clara, the one who lived in her father's house, would have recoiled. She would have apologized, flustered and ashamed, for her poorly worded offer. But that Clara was 1,500 miles away, the woman who stood in this shop, the one who had scrubbed its floors and faced down its ghosts, did not back away. She held his gaze, and in that moment, she saw past the harsh pride to the deep, hidden wound it was designed to protect. She understood, in a way she could not have articulated, that his entire life had been a fight against being seen as pitiable. His pride was his armor, just as her silence had been hers. And she knew, with an instinct that came from her own scarred heart, that to apologize would be the worst possible insult. It would validate his assumption that she saw him as someone to be pitied. So she did the only thing she could. She spoke the truth. She looked directly into his guarded, winter blue eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "Don't need to be guarded," she said. The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, an acknowledgement. She laid no blame, offered no comfort. She simply held up a mirror and showed him the reflection of the wall he had just built between them. She was not offering pity. She was offering recognition. The effect on him was profound. The anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by a raw, unguarded shock. It was as if she had reached past his defenses and touched the vulnerable man beneath. No one, she sensed, had ever done that before. No one had ever called him on his armor. They had either fought against it or been turned away by it. She had simply named it. For a long, breathless moment, he stared at her, his mask completely gone. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes: confusion, vulnerability, a question for which there were no words. The tension in the room was no longer the sharp edge of conflict, but the taut, vibrating string of shared understanding. They were two solitary people, standing in a quiet room, who had, in 3 short sentences, recognized the shape of each other's wounds. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the expression was gone. The mask of neutrality slid back into place, but it didn't fit quite as well as it had before. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out of the shop, leaving the jacket and the silver dollar sitting on the counter. He didn't look back. Clara stood motionless, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade into the ambient noises of the town. She was left alone in the silence, with the scent of leather and the heavy weight of the unspoken hanging in the air. She looked down at the jacket, his second skin, and the gleaming coin, his discarded armor. She reached out and slowly, gently, pushed the coin aside. Then she picked up the jacket and carried it back to her workbench, the weight of it a new and solemn responsibility. She had a promise to keep, not one of words, but of thread and needle. She was not just mending a tear in a piece of leather. She was mending a tear in a man's trust. The leather jacket was finished. Clara had taken her time, her stitches small, even and stronger than the original seam. She used a heavy, waxed thread the color of dried flax, and a 3-sided needle that pierced the thick hide with a satisfying, resolute pop. The mended tear was no longer a wound, but a scar, a clean, honest line that told a story of damage and repair. It was whole again. Yet it remained on a hook behind her counter, and the silver dollar Luke had left sat in a small wooden box beneath it. He had not returned for the jacket, but he had returned for other things. He fell into a pattern, a quiet rhythm that began to weave itself into the fabric of her days. He would appear in the late afternoon, when the sun slanted low and cast long shadows across the dusty street. He never came empty-handed. Once, it was a pair of thick leather gauntlets with a split seam at the thumb. Another time, a canvas bedroll with a tear near the grommet. They were small, insignificant repairs, transparent excuses that neither of them acknowledged. He would place the item on her counter, nod a greeting, and then retreat to a corner of the shop, often by the window that looked out onto the main road. And there he would stand, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour, in a silence that was as profound and natural as the quiet of the deep woods. He would watch the sparse traffic of Hollow Ridge, a buckboard rattling past, a rider trotting his horse to the saloon, his gaze distant, his thoughts his own. Clara would work. The rhythmic snip of her scissors and the soft whir of her sewing machine the only sounds in the room. His presence was a comfort, a solid, grounding weight in the corner of her world. He asked nothing of her, and she offered nothing but the quiet acceptance of his being there. It was a strange, unspoken friendship, built not on words, but on shared solitude. Then came the day of the rain. It started in the morning as a high gray mist that softened the sharp edges of the pine-covered hills. By afternoon, it had resolved itself into a steady, vertical drizzle that turned the street to a slick of reddish mud. The world outside Clara's window seemed to dissolve into a watercolor of blurred shapes and muted colors. The rain drummed a soft, hypnotic rhythm on the tin roof of the depot, effectively isolating the small shop from the rest of the world, wrapping it in a cocoon of gray light and sound. He arrived just as the rain began to fall in earnest, shaking the water from his hat before stepping inside. He brought no item for repair this time. He simply closed the door behind him, shutting out the chill, and walked to his usual spot by the window. Clara looked up from the dress she was hemming for the blacksmith's wife, offered him a small nod, and he returned it. The ritual was the same, but the atmosphere was different. The rain changed the quality of the silence, making it deeper, more intimate. They were two people on a small, dry island in a world of water. He stood watching the rain run in rivulets down the glass for a long time. Clara worked, her needle moving in and out of the blue calico, her stitches as even and steady as the rainfall. The only sounds were the drumming on the roof and the whisper of her thread. "My mother," he said, his voice so low it seemed at first like a part of the rain song. She favored days like this. Clara's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, then resumed their work. She did not look up. She did not speak. She knew, with an instinct she was coming to trust, that this was a rare and fragile moment. Words would shatter it. All she had to do was listen. He remained facing the window, his reflection a faint, ghostly outline on the wet glass. Said it was the world's way of washing itself clean. She'd bake bread on rainy days. The whole cabin would smell of yeast and damp earth. He paused, lost in a memory that was almost a lifetime away. She was soft, kind. Everything she touched seemed to grow. Clara finished a length of thread, knotted it with a deft twist of her fingers, and snipped it clean. She did not prompt him. She let the silence stretch, giving him the space to continue or to retreat. "Fever took her," he said, the words blunt and stripped of all emotion. "I was 8. My father, he's a hard man. He don't hold with softness. Reckoned it was a weakness. Reckoned it was her kindness that made her weak enough for the sickness to take hold." He finally turned from the window, but he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the far wall, on a past he could see as clearly as if it were painted there. "He made sure I wasn't weak. He taught me that you don't get hurt if you're hard enough, that you don't miss what you never let yourself have." In that stark, simple confession, Clara understood everything about him, his guarded eyes, his silent ways, his reluctance to accept a simple kindness. He had been raised to believe that tenderness was a fatal flaw, that vulnerability was a death sentence. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress around his heart, and he was now standing in the middle of it, pointing out the stones. Clara picked up his mended jacket from its hook. She laid it on her work table and began to replace a loose button at the cuff. A small, unnecessary repair she had noticed earlier. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute, her quiet. Methodical work was the only answer she could give him. It was an answer that said, "*I am still here. I am not running. Your story is safe in this room." He watched her hands, the way her long, capable fingers manipulated the needle and thread, the way she made something whole and secure. The silence returned. but it was now filled with the weight of his revealed history. Finally, when she had knotted the thread on the button and snipped it, the silence broke again. "Aren't you afraid of me?" he asked. The question was real. She looked up and met his eyes. The usual guard was down, and beneath it was a raw vulnerability. He wasn't asking if she feared his size or his strength. He was asking if she was afraid of the man his father had made, the man who had been taught that softness was a disease. He was asking if his brokenness was too much for her to bear. He expected her to be afraid. He was used to people being afraid. Clara put her needle down. She looked at him, at his hard face and his wounded eyes, at the immense effort it had cost him to speak those words. And she thought of her own life, of the suitors who had shied away from her spirit, of the father who had sent her away for being too much herself. She thought of all the people who had looked at her and seen something to be feared or fixed. "I'm only afraid," she said, her voice low and certain, "of the people who never dare to stay." Her answer was not the one he expected. It wasn't a denial or a reassurance. It was a confession of her own. It told him that his past didn't frighten her. What frightened her was the thought of him being just like all the others, a temporary presence, a fleeting connection, another person who would eventually walk away. She had matched his vulnerability with her own, and in doing so, had completely disarmed him. Luke stared at her, the truth of her words sinking into him. He, who had spent his life keeping people at a distance, was being told that the only thing to fear was that very distance. He had no response. There were no words for what he felt. He walked to the work table and picked up his jacket. He ran his thumb over the new button, then along the strong, neat scar on the shoulder. He put the jacket on. It settled on his shoulders like a familiar skin, but it felt different now. It felt whole. Then he did something that stopped Clara's breath. He reached up and took off his hat. It was a plain, dusty thing, its shape molded by years of sun and rain and the pressure of his own hand. For a man like him, a hat was not an accessory. It was a part of his identity. He held it for a moment, then placed it gently on the corner of her work table, next to her pincushion and her shears. He looked at her one last time, a long, searching look that said more than an hour of conversation. Then he turned and walked out into the rain, closing the door softly behind him. Clara was alone. The sound of the rain on the roof was the only movement in the quiet room. On her table, where he had stood, sat his hat, a silent promise, an anchor, a reason to return. She reached out and touched the worn, rain-dampened felt. She did not lift it. She did not put it on. It wasn't hers to claim. But as the gray afternoon faded into a wet twilight, she cleared a special peg on the wall behind her counter and hung the hat there, where it would be safe, where it would wait. It was his piece of himself, left in her keeping, a silent testament to a man who was, perhaps, learning how to stay. A man's hat, left behind in a woman's shop, is not a thing that goes unnoticed in a town like Hollow Ridge. It speaks a language louder than any church bell, a silent, damning testament to time spent and comfort taken. Luke Calhoun's hat, hanging on its peg behind Clara's counter, became the focal point of the town's simmering curiosity. It was visible from the street to anyone who cared to look, and in Hollow Ridge, everyone cared to look. The gossip started as a low hum, a thing of sidelong glances and conversations that paused when Clara entered the general store. The women who had once offered her a cool but civil nod now turned their backs, whispering behind their hands. They saw a woman living alone, unbeholden to a husband or father, and a quiet, solitary man choosing to spend his time in her world of thread and fabric instead of the saloon's world of whiskey and cards. It was an arrangement they did not understand, and what they did not understand, they condemned. The men's talk was coarser, more direct. It took place on the porch of the saloon, fueled by cheap liquor and a shared, resentful suspicion of anything different. Jed and Silas, the two who had first confronted Clara, became the self-appointed narrators of this burgeoning scandal. To them, Luke Calhoun had always been an outsider, a man who kept his own counsel and was respected for his capability, but not liked for his distance. Now, they saw his visits to the seamstress as a weakness, a crack in his formidable armor. They saw Clara not as a respectable business owner, but as a lure, a strange, too tall woman who had somehow ensnared one of their own. Clara and Luke felt the change in the town's temperature, though they never spoke of it. The chill was in the air when they passed on the street, in the sudden silence that fell when Luke entered the blacksmith's, in the narrowed eyes of the preacher's wife. This shared ostracism had a peculiar effect. Instead of driving them apart, it solidified the quiet space they shared within the depot's four walls, making it more of a sanctuary than ever. The hostile world outside made the peace within more precious. Their afternoons continued in their established rhythm. He would arrive with some token repair and settle by the window, while she worked at her table. But now, a new element had entered their silence. It was an awareness of the town's judgment, a shared secret that bound them closer. They were allies in an unspoken war, partners in a crime they had not committed. One evening in late summer, the air thick and hot with the promise of a coming thunderstorm, Luke stayed later than usual. Clara had been working on a complex quilt order, and he had sat, watching her hands move with their steady, hypnotic grace. When she finally set her work aside, the light outside had faded to a deep, bruised purple. "You should go," she said softly, breaking a silence that had lasted nearly an hour. "The storm will be here soon." He nodded, rising from his chair. "I'll fetch my hat." He walked to the peg behind the counter, and she watched him settle the familiar, worn hat on his head. For a moment, they just stood there, the rising wind rattling the window pane, the unspoken tension of the town seeming to press in on them from all sides. He gave her his customary nod and turned to the door. Clara felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The saloons would be full now, the men restless and emboldened by the coming storm. Luke stepped out onto the boardwalk, his boots thudding on the wood. He had only taken a few steps toward the livery when the expected challenge came, a parallelogram of yellow. Smoky light fell from the saloon doors, pinning him in place. Jed and Silas were lounging against the porch railings, their postures a study in lazy aggression. They were not alone. A few other men were with them, their faces shadowed and indistinct. "Evening, Calhoun," Jed called out, his voice carrying a deliberate, mocking drawl. "Leaving your lady friend so soon?" Luke stopped. He didn't turn immediately, but his body went still, his shoulders setting in a hard, straight line. He had known this was coming. He had felt it building for weeks. "Just making sure she's safe before the storm," Silas added with a wink to his friends. "A real gentleman." Laughter, rough and unpleasant, followed the remark. Luke turned then, slowly, to face them. He said nothing. His silence, which had been a comfort in Clara's shop, became a weapon in the street. Jed pushed himself off the railing and sauntered forward, stopping a few feet from Luke. He looked him up and down, his eyes lingering on Luke's clean, mended jacket. "You spending all your time in that sewing circle now, getting soft on us?" "Calhoun." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to Luke's boots. "Tell me, you planning on marrying that seamstress taught her how to cook a decent meal yet?" The insult was perfectly crafted, a triple-barbed dart aimed at Luke's pride, Clara's honor, and her feminine worth. It was the kind of remark that, in the world Luke had been raised in, demanded one response and one response only: a fist. Inside the shop, Clara heard the voices. She blew out her main lamp but left a small one burning in the back, then moved to the edge of the front window, peering through the glass into the growing dark. She saw the tableau Luke, a solitary, rigid figure, and the pack of men circling him like coyotes. Her hand flew to her mouth. She felt the old, familiar fear, the instinct to hide, to lock the door and wait for the trouble to pass. She saw Luke's hands clench into fists at his sides. She saw the corded muscles in his jaw tighten. She could almost feel the violent rage that was coiling inside him. A lifetime of his father's lessons screaming that this insult to his and her honor must be met with blood. This was their goal, to drag him down to their level, to force him into a brawl that would prove he was no different from them. But then, as she watched, something remarkable happened. Luke's fists, still clenched, lowered slightly. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air whistling almost silently between his teeth. His gaze, which had been fixed on Jed with a murderous intensity, seemed to shift, to look through him, as if seeing something else entirely. Clara knew, with a certainty that made her own heart ache, that he was seeing her. He was seeing their quiet afternoons. He was seeing her steady hands at work, her calm face, her refusal to be broken by this town. He was remembering a different kind of strength, a resilience that had nothing to do with violence. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, but all the rage had been stripped from it. It was as calm and solid as bedrock. "She's teaching me," Luke said, his words dropping into the charged silence like stones into a deep well, how to stand tall without a fist. The men stared at him, their smirks frozen on their faces. The response was so unexpected, so completely outside the script of a frontier confrontation, that it left them utterly baffled. They had come armed for a fist fight and had been met with a poem. They had no idea what to do with it. Jed opened his mouth, then closed it again, his blustering rage deflating into pure confusion. It was in that moment of stunned silence that the door to the depot opened. Clara stepped out onto the boardwalk. She wasn't holding a weapon. Her hands were empty at her sides. Her face, illuminated by the light spilling from the saloon, was not angry or frightened. It was composed, her expression one of mild, regal disappointment, as if she had just discovered her pupils cheating on a test. She walked forward and stopped, not beside Luke in a defensive posture, but a few feet away, forming a separate, independent point of strength. Her gaze swept over the men, missing none of them, before finally settling on Jed. "I cook for myself," she said, her voice as clear and cool as well water. It cut through the thick, humid air with absolute authority. "But I don't serve anyone who doesn't know how to sit and eat properly." She did not raise her voice. She did not issue a threat. She simply took their grubby insult about her domestic skills and held it up to the light, revealing it for what it was, a reflection of their own lack of civility. She had not only defended herself, but she had passed judgment on them, and found them wanting in the most basic of human decencies. The defeat of Jed and Silas was total and absolute. They had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and made to look like fools, all without a single punch being thrown. They had tried to start a brawl and had ended up in a lesson on etiquette. A low chuckle came from one of the men in the shadows. The tension broke. Shamed and furious, Jed shot one last, hateful look at Clara and Luke before turning on his heel and stomping back into the saloon, his cronies trailing after him like dogs with their tails between their legs. The street was suddenly empty. The only sounds were the rising wind and the distant rumble of thunder. Clara and Luke stood in the charged space, the aftermath of the battle hanging between them. He turned to her, his face still grim, but the hardness in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, profound gratitude. He had fought the biggest battle of his life, the one against his own ingrained violence, and he had won, but he knew he had not won it alone. He opened his mouth to say thank you, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate. She simply gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of pride, of complete and total understanding. He took a step toward her, then stopped. Instead, he just said her name, the first time he had ever spoken it aloud. "Clara." "Luke," she replied, her voice soft. That was all. It was enough. Together, they turned from the garish light of the saloon and walked into the growing darkness, side by side, They did not touch, but a new and powerful connection had been forged between them in the crucible of the town's contempt. They had taught each other that true strength wasn't in the power of a fist, but in the courage to stand your ground with nothing but your own dignity. The days that followed the confrontation in the street were marked by a new kind of quiet. The town's animosity had not vanished. It had simply retreated, curdling into a sullen, watchful silence. Jed and his cronies no longer offered open taunts, but their glares were a constant, low-grade poison. The women of Hollow Ridge now treated Clara with a kind of fearful respect, as if she were a strange species of plant that might be beautiful but was probably venomous. They still did not embrace her, but they no longer underestimated her. For Clara and Luke, the incident had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of formality between them. Their afternoon silences in the shop were no longer just comfortable. They were deeply intimate. They had stood together against the town's ugliness and had won, not with fists or fury, but with a shared, quiet dignity. A bond forged in such a fire is stronger than one built of pleasantries and shared smiles. It is a thing of iron and bedrock. Luke still came, but he had run out of items that needed mending. He no longer bothered with the pretense. He would simply arrive as the afternoon light softened, take his seat by the window, and they would inhabit the quiet space together. Sometimes he would watch her work, mesmerized by the deft, efficient movements of her hands. Other times, he would stare out at the street, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. But his presence was different now. He was not just a visitor. He was a part of the room's geography, as essential as the work table and the shelves of fabric. One evening, a week after the confrontation, he stayed as she was closing up. The sun had set, and she was lighting the lamps, the soft, golden glow pushing back the blue twilight that gathered in the corners of the room. He had been unusually still all afternoon. A deep, contemplative mood settled upon him like a heavy coat. He stood up from his chair and walked not to the door, but to the counter where she was tidying her spools of thread. He picked up a leather-bound thimble, turning it over and over in his calloused fingers. "My father," he began, his voice low, continuing a conversation that had started in the rain weeks ago. He had a saying, "A hard hand makes a hard man." He believed a boy's spirit was like a wild colt. You had to break it, or it would throw you. Clara stopped her work, her hands stilling on a spool of black thread. She kept her eyes on her hands, giving him the space to speak without the pressure of her gaze. "He had a strap," Luke went on, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. It was the voice of a man stating a fact, like giving the dimensions of a corral. It was his favorite tool for teaching, for when I was too slow with my chores, or when I spoke out of turn, or when I cried after my mother was gone. Especially then. He saw tears as a kind of rust, a weakness that had to be scoured away before it took hold. He put the thimble down. The tiny sound of it touching the wood was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stood with his back to her, facing the shelves of colored fabric. It was a strange contrast, his dark, solid form against the soft, hopeful colors of her trade. "That night," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "with Jed, when he said what he did about you, all I could hear was my father's voice, telling me that a real man answers an insult with his fists, that anything less is weakness." He paused. For a second, I was going to be the hard man he made. He turned around slowly, in the warm lamplight. His face was a landscape of shadows, his eyes dark, unreadable pools. But then I thought of you, standing in this room, making things whole again, and I knew he was wrong. Your kind of strength. It's quieter, but it's heavier, it holds more weight. He stopped, struggling with words that had no place in the vocabulary his father had given him. There was a chasm between what he felt and what he knew how to say. So he showed her instead. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unbuttoned the cuffs of his work shirt. He turned his back to her again and shrugged the shirt halfway down his shoulders, letting it hang from his arms, The lamplight fell across the broad, muscled expanse of his back, and it fell upon the scars. They were not the clean, heroic scars of battle. They were old and white, a pale, chaotic latticework against his tanned skin. They crisscrossed his shoulders and back, some thin as thread, others wider, like faded ribbons of moonlight. They were the ghosts of a boy's pain, the permanent record of a father's cruel lessons. This was the testament of the breaking of the colt. Clara looked, and her heart did not break with pity. It ached with a terrible, fierce recognition. She saw not just the scars, but the child who had borne them in silence. She saw the boy who had been taught that his own pain was a source of shame. She saw the man who had carried this secret map of his own suffering, hidden beneath his shirt, for his entire life. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She did not offer a single word of comfort, for she knew that comfort was not what he was seeking. He was seeking a witness. He was taking the most broken part of himself and holding it out in the light, asking for nothing more than to be seen. And so she did the only thing she could. She answered his silent confession with her own. He was still standing with his back to her when he heard the soft rustle of her clothing. He turned his head slightly, and in the periphery of his vision, he saw her move. She was standing beside her work table, her expression calm, her gray eyes filled with a profound and sorrowful understanding. She did not approach him. She simply stood her ground. Slowly, she undid the button at the cuff of her left sleeve, the one farthest from him. With the same deliberate, unhurried grace she brought to her sewing, she rolled the crisp cotton fabric up her arm, once, then twice, past the elbow. She held her arm out slightly, turning it so the lamplight could find it. On the pale, tender skin of her inner forearm was a scar. It was different from his, not a line, but a patch of silvery, puckered skin, the shape of a spilled teardrop. It was an old burn, long since healed, but its story was written just as clearly as his. The skin was smooth in a way that was unnatural, a permanent interruption in the landscape of her body. Luke looked from the crisscrossing marks on his own back to the single, stark blemish on her arm. He slowly pulled his shirt back up over his shoulders, his movement stiff, as if his muscles had forgotten how to work. He turned fully to face her, his gaze locked on the scar. "My father remarried a year after my mother died," Clara said, her voice as level and factual as his had been. A woman who believed children, especially girls, should be models of perfect efficiency. "I was 12. I was making soup for dinner. I spilled a ladle of it on the floor while taking it from the hearth." She paused, and in that pause lay a world of cold kitchens and colder hearts. She said it was a lesson in carelessness I would not forget. There it was, a truth for a truth, a scar for a scar. His, born of a father's twisted idea of strength, hers, of a stepmother's cruel notion of discipline. Both were marks of a love that had been withheld, of a childhood that had been a place of peril instead of safety. They stood in the golden lamplight, separated by 10 feet of wooden floor but joined by an invisible, unbreakable bridge of shared pain. They did not touch, they did not need to. Their eyes did all the work, seeing, acknowledging, and finally, accepting the flawed, damaged, beautiful truth of who they were. They were not just the strong, silent cowboy and the fiercely independent seamstress. They were survivors. Luke looked from her scar back to her face, and for the first time, the last of the winter frost melted from his eyes. What replaced it was a warmth so deep and real it made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "We don't have to hide them anymore," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. It was more than a statement. It was a release, a declaration of freedom. Clara looked down at her arm, at the silvery mark that she had kept hidden under long sleeves for 16 years. She looked at him, at the man who had just shown her his own secret history. A small, sad, but resolute smile touched her lips. "No," she agreed softly. She slowly rolled her sleeve back down, the simple act now feeling like a choice, not a necessity. We just have to stop others from doing it again. His and hers, past and future. His words had acknowledged the pain they had carried. Hers had claimed the strength they now possessed. It was a pact, made in the quiet of a small shop at the edge of nowhere. They were no longer defined by the scars they bore. They were defined by the fact that they had shown them to each other. And in that shared vulnerability, they had found a new and fearless kind of strength. Winter arrived in Hollow Ridge not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a sharp, clear cold that scoured the sky to a brilliant, unforgiving blue and turned every breath into a plume of white smoke. The wind that swept down from the pine hills had a razor's edge, but it carried with it a sense of finality, of a world stripped down to its essential truths. It was in this stark, clean season that the town held its annual winter fair. It was less a fair and more a determined gathering against the encroaching dark, a communal bonfire of fellowship. Lanterns were strung across the main street, casting a warm, flickering glow on the hard-packed, frozen earth. The air, usually smelling only of pine and dust, was now rich with the scent of roasting venison, spiced cider, and the sweet, nostalgic aroma of melting molasses. From a makeshift stage in front of the livery, a fiddler sawed away at a lively tune, the cheerful notes a stark contrast to the vast, cold silence of the surrounding wilderness. From her shop window, Clara watched the town come alive. She saw families walking together, children's faces bright with excitement. She saw men who usually only spoke in grunts, laughing with their neighbors. It was a picture of community, a tapestry of belonging from which she felt utterly separate. For weeks, the fair had been the main topic of conversation for the few customers she had. They spoke of the quilting competition, the shooting contest, the barn dance that would cap the evening. And through it all, an unspoken question had hung in the air: would she go? And more importantly, would she go with him? Luke had said nothing of the fair, but his presence in her shop in the preceding days had been charged with a quiet anticipation. The town's gaze was upon them, and to appear together at the most significant social event of the year would be a public declaration. It would be an act of defiance, a final, irrevocable statement that they stood together, regardless of the whispers and the judgment. Clara wanted to go. A part of her, a part she had long thought buried, yearned to walk through the lantern light, to hear the music up close, to be, for one night, just another person in the crowd. She had even made herself a new cloak. It was a deep forest green, the wool thick and warm, lined with a soft, dove-gray flannel. The clasp at the throat was a simple, elegant piece of carved juniper wood she had purchased from a traveling peddler. Making it had been an act of hope, a stitching together of a future she wasn't sure she was brave enough to claim. Now, the cloak lay across her work table. The music from the street drifted in, a cheerful, insistent summons. The shop was dark, save for a single lamp that cast a pool of golden light on the floor. She stood in the shadows, her hand resting on the cold brass of the doorknob, a prisoner in her own sanctuary. The voices had returned, not the whispers of the town, but the older, more insidious ghosts from her past. Asterisk. You are too tall, too stubborn, unfit. They told her that to step out that door on Luke's arm would be to make a spectacle of herself. They painted a picture of the scene, the music faltering as they passed, the heads turning, the cruel smiles exchanged behind gloved hands. They reminded her of every ballroom she had ever stood in, a wallflower by virtue of her height and her unyielding spirit. The old shame, cold and familiar, washed over her, and her courage evaporated. Her hand, which had been steady, began to tremble. A soft knock at the door made her jump. It was Luke. She knew it without looking. She opened it, and he stepped inside, bringing a gust of the cold, festive air with him. He was dressed in a clean shirt and his mended leather jacket. He had made an effort. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his face, freshly shaven, looked stark and handsome in the lamplight. His gaze took in the dark shop, the finished cloak on the table, and her, standing by the door like a startled deer. He understood in an instant. He didn't ask if she was ready. He didn't mention the fare. He simply walked to the window and looked out at the lights, giving her a moment to compose herself. "The fiddler's got a quick bow," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that calmed the frantic beating of her heart. "Yes," she managed to say, her own voice thin and tight. He turned from the window. His cool blue eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a perfect, mirror-like understanding of her fear. He saw the ghosts that held her captive. She expected him to try and persuade her, to say, "There's nothing to be afraid of," a lie that would have only made her feel weaker. She expected him to take her by the arm, a gentle but firm pressure that would have felt like a cage. He did neither. He simply stood there, a silent witness to her struggle. He was letting the choice be entirely hers. He would not save her from this. He would, however, give her a weapon for the fight. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and took off his hat. It was the same hat that had hung on the peg in her shop, the same hat he had left in a silent promise. It was more than just a piece of felt. It was a part of him. It was his shield against the world, the brim that shadowed his thoughts, the crown that held the memory of sun and rain and the silent miles of his life. He held it in his hands for a moment. Then he stepped forward. He did not try to touch her. He simply extended his hands and placed the hat into hers. It was warm from his body, and the worn felt was soft beneath her trembling fingers. The weight of it was surprising, a solid, tangible thing in her grasp. It was an offering of trust so complete, so profound, that it stole her breath. He was giving her his armor. He was making himself vulnerable, so that she might feel strong. She stared down at the hat, then looked up at his face. His expression was serious, his eyes searching hers. She had to ask. The question was not just about the hat, but about everything it represented: the public declaration, the shared defiance, the future it implied. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant fiddle music. A change came over his face. The grim, stoic lines around his mouth softened. For the first time since she had met him, a genuine, undeniable smile touched his lips. It was a small thing, just a slight upturn at the corners, but on his guarded face, it had the power of a sunrise. The smile reached his eyes, and the winter blue ice in them thawed, revealing a warmth that flowed through her, chasing away the last of the ghosts. "About you," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Always." The word, spoken with such simple, absolute certainty, was the key that unlocked her prison. Asterisk, always, asterisk. It was the answer to every doubt she had ever had about herself. It was the validation her soul had craved for a lifetime. He was not just sure about her in this moment. He had been sure about her from the very beginning. A new strength, fierce and bright, flooded through her. The fear was gone, burned away by the warmth of his smile. She looked down at the hat in her hands, no longer an object to be protected, but a mantle to be worn. With a steady hand, she lifted it. She paused for a fraction of a second, then settled it firmly on her head. It was a little too big, settling low on her brow, but it felt right. It felt like courage. It smelled of him of leather and dust and the clean scent of the open air. It was a banner, not a disguise. Wearing it was not an act of hiding, but an act of claiming. She was claiming her place at his side. Her hand, no longer shaking, closed firmly around the doorknob. She looked at him, her eyes shining from beneath the brim of his hat, and gave him a resolute nod. Without a word, she turned the knob, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold winter night. The lantern light and the music washed over her. She did not flinch. She did not lower her head. She kept her gaze straight ahead, fixed on the heart of the celebration. A moment later, Luke stepped out behind her, bareheaded in the cold. He fell into his customary place, a half step behind and to her right, a silent, steady presence at her back. And together, the woman wearing the cowboy's hat and the cowboy who had given it to her, they walked toward the light, their footsteps falling in a steady, even rhythm on the frozen ground. They were not afraid. They were not hiding. They were simply two people, whole and unbroken, walking into their own future. The truce between Clara and the town of Hollow Ridge was as fragile as the first green shoots of spring pushing through the frozen earth. The winter fair had marked a turning point, but it had not brought about a true thaw, instead of open taunts. Clara and Luke were now met with a wall of cold, resentful silence. They had refused to be shamed, and for that, the town could not forgive them. Their quiet dignity was an affront, a mirror that reflected the town's own petty cruelty back at it. The tension needed a new outlet, and it found one in the earth itself. As the snows melted, a prospector, new to the area, discovered a rich vein of gold in the creek that ran through the old, long-disputed Miller claim, the land. A rocky parcel nobody had wanted for 50 years, suddenly became the most valuable piece of property in the county. Greed, a far more potent and dangerous emotion than gossip, swept through Hollow Ridge like a fever. Old maps were consulted, arguments broke out in the saloon, and a hard, grasping look came into the eyes of many men. It was Jed and Silas who saw the opportunity. Their public humiliation at Clara's hands had festered into a deep, malignant hatred. They could not attack her directly, she had proven too formidable for that, but they could strike at Luke. He was the perfect target, a loner, a man with no family to speak for him, known to ride for days at a time in the very hills where the gold lay. The accusation was made on a Tuesday. In the dusty, makeshift office of the town magistrate, Jed, his face a mask of civic concern, claimed he had seen Luke Calhoun sneaking onto the Miller claim late at night, a shovel and pan on his saddle. Silas, with a solemn nod, swore he had seen the same, adding the detail of a small pouch that looked heavy with more than just trail rations. It was a lie woven from whole cloth, but it was a believable lie. It fit the narrative the town wanted to hear, that the aloof outsider was trying to cheat them all. Word spread faster than a prairie fire. By late afternoon, a crowd had gathered in the main street. It was not the festive crowd of the winter fair, but a grim, angry mob, their face tight with suspicion and avarice. The town marshal, a man named Davies, whose authority was directly proportional to the mood of the most powerful citizens, was deputized by the magistrate to bring Luke in for questioning. It was not an investigation. It was a prelude to a verdict. They found Luke exactly where they expected to find him, leaving Clara's shop. He had been helping her move a heavy bolt of canvas, and he stepped out onto the boardwalk, straight into the path of the marshal and a half-dozen armed men. Luke stopped, his body going instantly still. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance, Marshal Davies's nervous expression, Jed and Silas standing just behind him with triumphant smirks, the sea of hostile faces that filled the street. He understood immediately. He had lived his whole life on the edge of other men's tempers, and he knew the smell of a brewing storm. "Luke Calhoun," Davies said, his voice straining to sound official. "You're to come with me. There's a charge been laid against you, claim jumping." Luke's gaze shifted from the marshal to Jed, and a look of cold, profound contempt passed over his face. He didn't have to ask who had laid the charge. He simply said, "It's a lie." "That's for the magistrate to decide," Davies said, gesturing with his pistol. "Now, are you coming quiet?" Luke's hands, which had been hanging loose at his sides, slowly curled into fists. He was being tried and convicted in the street by a mob led by his sworn enemies. Every instinct, every lesson from his father, screamed at him to fight. But he looked past the marshal, to the doorway of the shop. He saw Clara standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear she was trying desperately to conceal. To fight now would be to prove them right, to become the violent, lawless man they already believed him to be. It would endanger her. With a visible, heroic effort, he unclenched his hands. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Quiet," he said, just as the marshal reached out to take his arm. The door to the depot swung fully open. Clara stepped out. She was not the hesitant, uncertain woman who had arrived in Hollow Ridge months ago. She was not the defiant woman who had calmly put Jed in his place. This was a new Clara, one forged in the fires of the town's contempt and tempered by the steel of her own resolve. She moved with the serene, unshakable purpose of a force of nature. In one hand, she carried her thick, leather-bound business ledger. In the other, a small, neatly folded bundle of cloth. The crowd stirred, parting for her as she walked. She did not look at them. Her eyes were fixed on Marshal Davies. She stopped a few feet from him, her posture as straight and true as one of her own needles. "Marshal," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with such clarity that it cut through the murmuring of the crowd. "You have made a mistake." Davies, flustered by this interruption, blustered. "This is official business. Miss Ward, it's no concern of yours." When an innocent man is falsely accused, it becomes the concern of every honest citizen, she replied, her gaze unwavering, and I have proof of his innocence. A jeer came from the crowd. What proof? The word of his woman. Clara's eyes flickered to the source of the voice, a cold, dismissive glance that silenced it instantly. She opened her ledger on the railing of the boardwalk, the pages held down by the wind. Her movements were methodical, precise. She was not a panicked woman defending a lover. She was a professional presenting a case. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice ringing out, "has stated that he saw Mr. Calhoun on the Miller claim last Thursday night, after sundown." She ran her finger down a page in her ledger. "At that time, Mr. Calhoun was in my shop. I was taking his measurements for a new shirt. Here is the pattern I drafted that evening." She unfolded a large sheet of brown paper covered in chalk lines and numbers. "And here is my entry, dated and timed. I believe you will find that a man cannot be in two places at once." She flipped a page. "Jedediah Stone claims to have seen Mr. Calhoun prospecting on Saturday. On Saturday morning, Mr. Calhoun was at my shop, commissioning a new cover for his saddle, which had been damaged. He paid for the canvas at 11 o'clock. Here's the receipt." She held up a slip of paper, her signature a clear, bold script at the bottom. He spent the rest of the day, as he told me he would, at his cabin, repairing it. His cabin is a good 5 miles east of the Miller claim. A nervous silence was beginning to fall over the crowd. This was not the simple, passionate denial they had expected. This was bookkeeping. It was the mundane, irrefutable language of fact. This is just her say-so," Jed sputtered, his confidence beginning to crack. She'd say anything for him. Clara ignored him. She reached for the small bundle of cloth and slowly, carefully, unwrapped it. Inside was a swatch of plain, homespun linen, but it had been dyed a peculiar, beautiful color, a rich, earthy red like sunset on wet clay. "This," she said, holding it up for all to see, "is the reason Mr. Calhoun was near the Miller claim a month ago. Long before any gold was found, he was not looking for treasure in the rocks. He was looking at the color of the dirt. He brought me a handful of the red clay from the creek bed because he thought the color was unique, and he wondered if it could be made into a dye." She held the cloth out. "This is the result. He was not there to take something from the land. He was there to admire it. The simple, unexpected beauty of the cloth, the quiet, poetic truth of her story, landed like a physical blow. It was so perfectly in character with the silent, observant man they knew Luke to be. In that moment, the entire town saw the absurdity of the accusation. They saw Jed and Silas not as concerned citizens, but as small, spiteful men, twisting an act of simple curiosity into a crime. "She's lying," Jed shouted, his voice shrill with desperation. "Trying to trick you all, don't listen to her. She's just—" He was cut off not by Luke, nor by the marshal, but by Clara herself. She turned her head and fixed Jed with a gaze so powerful, so filled with the accumulated force of every insult and injustice she had endured, that he physically recoiled. All the quiet dignity, all the righteous anger, all the steely resolve she possessed was focused into that single, soul-scorching look. When she spoke, her voice was low, yet it carried to the furthest edges of the crowd. Every single person fell silent to hear it. "This man is my friend," she said, her words measured and deliberate. She then turned her gaze from Jed to sweep across the faces of the entire town, indicting them all. "And I will not be interrupted when I stand for the one who taught me how to stand." It was done. The lie was broken. The mob, which moments before had been ready to haul a man to jail, now stood shamed and silent. They looked at the ground, at each other, anywhere but at the woman who had held up a mirror to their souls. Her words were not just about Luke. They were about her own journey. She, the woman they had scorned for being too tall, was now the only person in the street standing at her full height. Marshal Davies cleared his throat, his face red with embarrassment. He looked at the ledger, at the cloth, at the unwavering woman before him, and he knew he was defeated. "The charges are dismissed," he mumbled, and without another look at Luke, he turned and pushed his way through the suddenly quiet crowd. Jed and Silas were left exposed, their malice laid bare. They vanished into the throng, their power utterly broken. The rest of the crowd began to melt away, their anger replaced by a shamefaced reluctance to meet either Clara's or Luke's eye. Soon, they were alone in the street, the setting sun casting their long shadows on the dusty ground. The ledger lay open on the railing, its pages rustling in the evening breeze. Luke looked at Clara, at her calm, strong face, and the wall he had kept around his heart for a lifetime finally, completely, crumbled to dust. She had not just saved him, she had shown him. She had used her quiet tools, her needle and thread, her patterns and ledgers to fight a battle he would have fought with his fists. And she had won a victory more total than any he could have imagined. She had stood for him, and in doing so, had shown the whole world the unshakable foundation on which they both now stood. The exoneration of Luke Calhoun did not mend the fractures in Hollow Ridge. It simply rearranged them. The town, having been shown the ugliness of its own assumptions, reacted not with apology, but with a kind of grudging, silent recalibration. They had misjudged, and the proof was now a permanent part of their shared history, as irrefutable as the faded lettering on the general store sign. The change was most palpable in their treatment of Clara. Before, she had been an oddity, an object of suspicion and gossip. Now, she was a landmark. She had faced down a mob with a ledger and a piece of dyed cloth. She had wielded facts like a weapon and dignity like a shield. She had done something none of them, not the marshal, not the magistrate, not the blustering men in the saloon had been able to do. She had uncovered the truth. Respect, when it is earned under such circumstances, is a strange and cautious thing. The women of the town began to frequent her shop, their initial visits disguised as errands for thread or buttons, but they would linger, drawn to the quiet, orderly world she had built. The blacksmith's wife, who had once offered only clipped, one-word answers, now lingered to ask Clara's opinion on a new fabric. The preacher's wife, a woman whose disapproval had once been a palpable force, brought in her husband's finest coat for mending and quietly admitted that Clara's stitches were the truest she had ever seen. They were small offerings of peace, unspoken admissions that they had been wrong. Clara accepted their custom with the same calm, professional grace she had always possessed. She did not gloat. She did not mention the events in the street. She simply measured, cut, and sewed. Her steady competence a quiet lesson in itself. But inwardly, she felt the shift, the constant, draining weight of being an outsider had begun to lift. For the first time, when she walked the town's main street, she did not feel like an intruder. She felt like she was home. Luke, too, was treated differently. The men who had been so quick to believe in his guilt now gave him a wide berth, their eyes averted. The respect they had for his capability was now tinged with a new, uncertain fear, not of his fists, but of the quiet woman who stood at his back. Jed and Silas were largely unseen, their public shaming having driven them to the shadowy corners of the saloon, their power in the town utterly broken. In the weeks that followed, a new domestic rhythm established itself between Clara and Luke. His visits to the shop were no longer confined to the quiet observation of the late afternoon. He came in the mornings, bringing her a pail of fresh water from the town well before the day's dust had been kicked up. He came at midday, leaving a parcel of bread and cheese on her counter, a silent insistence that she stop her work and eat. And he came in the evenings, to walk with her to the edge of town, where the scent of pine was strongest and the stars seemed close enough to touch. They rarely spoke during these times. They did not need to. They had built a language for themselves out of shared silence, comfortable proximity, and the certain knowledge of each other's heart. They had shown each other their scars, and in doing so, had created a space where no words of comfort or explanation were necessary. One evening, as the last of the summer's warmth bled from the sky, they sat together on the small porch of her shop. Clara was in a rocking chair she had bought, its gentle, rhythmic creak a soothing counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. Luke sat on the top step, his back against a post, his long legs stretched out before him. The street was quiet, the lamps of the town casting soft, isolated pools of light in the gathering dusk. For a long time, he just watched her. He watched the way the fading light caught the honey-colored strands of hair that had escaped her bun. He watched her capable hands, now lying still in her lap, and thought of how those same hands had held up patterns and receipts and pieces of dyed cloth to save his life. He thought of the man he had been when he'd first walked into her shop, a man encased in a hard shell of his father's making. A man who believed that all the world's problems could be met with a hard fist or a harder silence. She had given him a new way of being. She had shown him a strength that did not require violence, a courage that was not predicated on the absence of fear, but on the willingness to stand in spite of it. He had come to her, time and again, to offer his protection, his quiet guardianship, and in the end, it was she who had protected him, in the most public and profound way imaginable. The old dynamic, the one he understood, was gone. He felt a deep, abiding peace in her presence, but also a kind of humble uncertainty. He no longer knew his place in her life. He cleared his throat, the sound a little rough in the quiet air. Clara's rocking slowed, and she turned her head to look at him, her silhouette a dark, graceful shape against the lamplight spilling from the window. "Do you still want me to teach you?" he asked. The question was so quiet, so freighted with unspoken meaning, that it hung in the air between them for a long moment. He was not asking about riding, or shooting, or any of the practical skills of this hard land. He was asking if she still needed him in the same way. He was asking if his purpose, the role of the silent protector who taught the newcomer how to be brave, was now fulfilled. He was asking, in his own guarded way, if she still had a place for him. For a moment, Clara was still. Then, a sound emerged from her that Luke had never heard before, a laugh. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a small, hesitant sound. It was a genuine, warm, and utterly carefree laugh, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that seemed to rise up from the very center of her soul. It was the sound of a woman who was no longer afraid. She rose from her rocking chair, the laughter still sparkling in her eyes. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared into the shop. Luke watched her go, a slow, confused smile beginning to form on his own face. The sound of her laughter was a revelation, a piece of music he hadn't known was missing from his life. She returned a moment later, In her hands, she held his hat. It had been hanging on its peg behind the counter since the night of the winter fair. A silent, waiting sentinel. She walked to him, stopping in front of the step where he sat. He looked up at her, and in her face, illuminated by the light from the doorway, he saw a tenderness and a playful affection that made his heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar pang. She held the hat for a moment. Then, with a slow, almost ceremonial grace, she lowered it and settled it on his head. Her fingers brushed against his hair. A touch so light and fleeting it was barely there, but it sent a jolt of warmth straight through him. The hat settled into its familiar place, its weight a comforting, long-lost pressure. It felt like he was finally whole again. She took a step back, her hands on her hips, and looked at him. Her head tilted to one side. A beautiful, genuine smile played on her lips. A smile that had finally, after so many years of sorrow, reached her eyes. "Now," she said, her voice soft but full of a gentle, loving authority. "It's my turn to teach." Luke sat there, on the porch of her shop, with the familiar weight of his own hat back on his head and the warmth of her smile washing over him. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply looked up at this tall, strong, incredible woman who had taught him how to stand, and for the first time in his memory, he smiled back. A slow, wide, and truly happy smile that had been waiting a lifetime to be returned. The lesson was over, and the lesson had just begun. Spring came to the high country on a soft, pine-scented wind, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing a shy, tender green from the iron-hard earth. With it came the spring market, an event that felt entirely different from its winter counterpart, where the winter fair had been a huddle against the dark. The spring market was an unfurling, a joyful explosion of life and commerce under a wide, benevolent sky. The main street of Hollow Ridge was transformed. Tables overflowed with seed packets, jars of preserved jams, and the vibrant, hopeful colors of new quilts. The air was alive with the sound of laughter, the lowing of cattle being appraised, and the bright, optimistic notes of a banjo played with more enthusiasm than skill. It was a day of new beginnings, and nowhere was that more evident than in Clara Estelle Ward. She moved through the heart of the market, a calm, steady presence in the bustling crowd. She wore a dress of her own making, a simple yet elegant garment of periwinkle blue cotton that brought out the clear gray of her eyes. It was not the severe, practical attire of her arrival, nor was it fashioned to the dictates of some far-off Eastern society. It was a dress that spoke of the woman who wore it. The cut was strong and clean, allowing for ease of movement. But the details, the delicate pintucks on the bodice, the row of tiny, hand-sewn mother-of-pearl buttons spoke of a quiet, confident femininity. She was not avoiding gazes today. She met the eyes of the townspeople as she passed, and the looks she received in return were no longer hostile or suspicious. They were looks of acknowledgement, of respect, and in some, even a hesitant warmth. She stopped to admire the blacksmith's intricate ironwork, her praise genuine and knowledgeable. She bought a small sack of wildflower seeds from his wife, discussing the best place to plant them in the thin soil behind her shop. She was no longer an island. She was part of the flow of the town's life, a thread that had been woven, however improbably, into its tapestry. She had built a life here, one stitch at a time. Her shop was thriving, her days filled with the purposeful, satisfying rhythm of her work. But the change was deeper than that. The fortress she had built to protect herself had become a home, its doors now open to the world. The constant, gnawing fear of judgment, the shame of being too much, too tall, too herself. It was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. As she stood near the town well, watching the happy chaos of the market, a small hand tugged on the skirt of her blue dress. She looked down to see a little girl of about 6 or 7, with wide, curious brown eyes and a smattering of freckles across her nose. It was the baker's youngest daughter. The little girl stared up at Clara, her head tilted all the way back, her expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. Children possess a brutal, beautiful honesty, a way of asking the questions that adults have learned to swallow. "Are you scared?" the little girl asked, her voice clear as a bell. "Being so tall?" For a fleeting second, the old wound twinged. The question was the ghost of every whisper, every mocking comment, every pained look from her father. It was the central, defining question of her old life, the one that had driven her 1,500 miles to this dusty, forgotten town. The old Clara would have flushed with shame, stammered a non-answer, and hurried away. But she was not the old Clara. She smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She did not answer from above. Instead, she gathered her skirts and gracefully knelt down in the dust, an act of profound humility and strength. She lowered herself until her face was level with the child's, until they were equals, woman to woman, looking directly into each other's eyes. The bustling market seemed to fade into a respectful silence around them. "I used to be," Clara said, her voice soft and confidential, a secret shared. "I used to be very scared." She reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind the little girl's ear. "But someone taught me that you don't have to stoop for anyone to see you." Her words were simple, but they held the entire weight of her journey. They were an epitaph for her fear and a monument to her love. She had learned to occupy her own space, to stand at her full height, not in defiance, but in simple, unapologetic acceptance of who she was. Across the square, leaning against the sun-warmed wall of the livery, Luke Calhoun watched the scene unfold. He was not standing guard. He was not positioned as a protector. He was simply watching the woman he loved be her own magnificent self. In his hands, he held an old, scarred guitar, the wood polished smooth by a musician's hands. It had been his mother's. For years, it had lain in a dusty corner of his cabin, a relic of the softness his father had tried so hard to beat out of him. Today, for the first time in 2 decades, he had taken it out, its silent strings a promise of a song yet to be played. He saw Clara kneel. He could not hear her words, but he didn't need to. He saw the transformation in the little girl's face from simple curiosity to wide-eyed understanding. He saw Clara rise, not with the awkwardness of a tall woman trying to make herself small, but with the fluid, certain grace of a pine tree reaching for the sun. He saw the strength in her, a force more powerful and enduring than any fist he could ever make, and his heart swelled with a pride so fierce and a love so deep it was almost painful. He did not need to step forward. She did not need him to. Clara stood, brushing the dust from her knees. Her gaze lifted and swept across the market, past the stalls and the people, searching for a single, familiar anchor. Her eyes found him. Across the distance, their gazes met and locked. He saw the question in her eyes fade, replaced by a radiant, certain smile. It was a smile that held no fear, no doubt, only a deep and abiding peace. He smiled back, a slow, easy smile that was no longer a stranger to his face. He did not move. He did not call out to her. He simply waited. And she began to walk. She did not hurry. Her steps were even, measured, and full of purpose. She moved through the crowd, which parted for her as if by instinct. She was no longer running from anything. She was walking toward everything. Each step was a testament to the journey she had made, a journey not across the country, but into the vast, uncharted territory of her own heart. She had arrived in Hollow Ridge seeking a life she had never been allowed, and she had found it by building it herself. She was walking toward him not because she needed a savior, but because her own hard-won courage had finally, irrevocably, led her home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, you can also support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.